By noon on the first day of the war, Israel had absolute air supremacy over Israeli, Egyptian, Jordanian and Syrian airspace. The Israeli Air Force could now be devoted almost exclusively to providing close air support to the ground forces fighting into Sinai, the West Bank and the Golan Heights.
Air superiority was absolutely crucial to the Israelis for many reasons. Strategically, it gave them reach. It allowed them to project their force over vast distances using relatively few assets. Operationally, it meant that they could be mobile between the various fronts. Because they had so many enemies surrounding them, they knew they would very probably have to fight one after another, just as they had to in the 1967 war. And this gave them the flexibility to do that at the operational level. Once air superiority had been gained, with the air flank open to them, they could use aircraft in a close air support role. They could actually support the advancing infantry and armour. They could interdict the enemy as he reinforced or tried to withdraw. They could also transport logistics using the air flank, and of course could also importantly drop airborne forces. So that package, that air superiority package, gave the Israelis the sort of flexibility that they needed at very many different levels.
The Egyptian army had prepared contingency plans for defending the Sinai in depth. Called Plan Kahir, the plan would allow the Israelis to advance deep into the Sinai, where they would be destroyed by Egyptian firepower. President Nasser told his army to shelve Plan Kahir. Instead, Nasser ordered his army to concentrate forward along the Israeli border to prepare for an invasion of Israel.
The Egyptian army wants to defend the Sinai Peninsula because Cairo is very close. But once this plan has been developed by the Egyptian General Staff, Nasser changes his mind. Because of his bellicose rhetoric, Nasser has to abandon the idea of using his army to defend Cairo, to defend the Sinai against an Israeli attack, and instead he has to go along with his bellicose rhetoric and position his army to attack.
The new Egyptian plan was to begin with a surprise air attack on the Israeli Air Force to achieve local air superiority over the Negev desert. Then, while the 20th Palestinian Liberation Army Division of the Egyptian Army attacked the Israelis from the Gaza Strip, the Egyptian 4th Armored Division would cut across southern Israel, linking up with the crack Jordanian 60th Armored Brigade to cut off the Israeli Red Sea port town of Eilat. The Egyptian 6th Motor Rifle Division, with the powerful Egyptian 1st Armored Division in support, would take Eilat and consolidate the Egyptian hold over southern Israel.
The Egyptian army's redeployment really put the armed forces in a position of great difficulty. They weren't expecting it and they weren't flexible. And the redeployment sent them to ground that they didn't know particularly well and hadn't necessarily trained for. It meant that the organisation that was so relatively strong whilst in Egypt, when put on a new piece of ground, all of a sudden showed a lack of cohesion. The sort of lack of cohesion that the Israeli armed forces knew they had to try and target and exploit when it came to battle.
They go into Sinai, they dig in to defend the Sinai, they're told abandon your field fortifications, move to a new position to attack the Israelis, now dig in. The Egyptian soldier cannot be bothered to dig in again. He's not well motivated, he's not well led, he's not being well treated, and yet another pointless movement in the Sinai just further demoralizes the Egyptian soldier. And that means that when the Israelis come, they're attacking not a dug-in enemy prepared to attack, they're attacking Egyptian soldiers who are not prepared to fight at all.
The Israeli concept of operations was first to break through the thick skin of the forward Egyptian units. Next, they would exploit westward to cross the Sinai on its three main east-west routes, heading along the coast and towards the passes through the mountains at the western edge of the peninsula. During the exploitation phase, they would engage and destroy the Egyptian reserve formations. The fiercest fighting came during the initial breakthrough on June the 5th, the first day of the war. Because the Egyptian army had been concentrated forward for an attack into Israel, it was hard to penetrate. At Abu Egela, the Egyptians had a prepared defensive position blocking the central route through the Sinai. The position had been prepared according to Soviet doctrine. Belts of trenches were anchored on the right by rocky crevices and hills, and on the left by shifting sand dunes. At their front were minefields covered by machine guns in the trenches and artillery to the rear. A few miles away, an armored strike force stood ready to counterattack. Brigadier Ariel Sharon sent his tanks by a roundabout route to block the Egyptian armor. He sent his paras by helicopter to assault the Egyptian artillery, shooting the gunners in their pits. His tanks and guns waited in front of the Egyptian defenses as his infantry moved through the shifting sand dunes on the Egyptians' left. When they had word that the Egyptian artillery had been silenced, the Israeli tanks and guns fired on the left edge of the Egyptian trenches. As the fire shifted, the Israeli infantry poured into the trenches, lighting colored flares to mark their progress. The Israeli tankers and gunners used these moving beacons to shift fire. Israeli sappers moved across the minefields, clearing paths for the Israeli armor. During the furious progress of the battle for the trenches, Brigadier Yoffi radioed Sharon, asking to move forward through the Abu Egela position. Sharon's mission was to allow Yoffi to move forward into the Sinai, so he agreed to one of the most dangerous operations in war, passing towards the enemy through friendly forces who were already fighting. Even before the Egyptian trenches had been secured, the leading elements of Yoffi's division were moving along the road past Abu Egela and crossed the Sinai. Because the Egyptian army had been concentrated so far forward, once the Israelis burst through, the Battle of the Sinai turned into a pursuit.
Once the Israelis are through the Egyptian forward deployed forces, once they're through the forces who are prepared to invade Israel, the Israelis have a much easier time of exploiting onwards because the Egyptians are on the back foot. From the time the Israelis get through the forward Egyptian defenses, the Egyptians are always reacting to what the Israelis are doing.
The Israelis had a fairly comprehensive intelligence picture of Egyptian deployments. They've been able to pick this up from a combination of human intelligence and signals intelligence and some reconnaissance patrols. And in essence, they knew that a gap had opened up between the Palestinian 20th Division, which is based in Gaza, and the Egyptian 7th Division, which was based to the west of Gaza. There was a place called Rafah Junction, and they knew that if they struck north at Rafah Junction, they would be actually driving along the boundary between the Egyptian 7th and the Palestinian 20th Divisions.
They knew their objectives and they could get behind the Egyptians and destroy their cohesion and then destroy the Egyptians actually in situ in the Sinai itself. And what it shows us is splendid Israeli military doctrine. They knew what objectives they could achieve. They had the all-arms cooperation with which to achieve that. They got the initial preemptive strike, then they had the speed and momentum to carry them through. And they get to the Suez Canal in just 100 hours. And it's got to go down as one of the remarkable maneuver warfare victories in the 20th century.
15,000 Egyptians were killed or wounded in 4 days of fighting. 5,000 soldiers were captured, along with 500 of their officers. 80% of Egypt's military hardware had been captured, including hundreds of tanks and hundreds of guns. Israel had lost 300 killed and over 1,000 wounded. It took 4 days of the Six-Day War for the Israelis to overrun the Egyptian army in the Sinai. By the 8th of June, the Egyptians were ready to accept a ceasefire. The task force set to drive to the southern tip of the Sinai were not needed. Israeli sailors came ashore at Sharm el-Sheikh to raise the Israeli flag over the Straits of Tiran. Israel expected to fight Egypt and Syria, possibly Jordan, plus forces from elsewhere in the Arab world. But they did not have the combat power to fight 2 or even 3 enemies at the same time. They therefore pursued Napoleon's strategy of the central position. When fighting a more powerful enemy, Napoleon said, "Put yourself between the enemy armies and fight them one at a time." While the Israelis were fighting Egypt, they defended against Jordan and Syria. When they saw that the battles in the Sinai were going well, late on the 5th of June, they threw their reserves into battle on the central front around Jerusalem. The Jordanian army, with some Egyptian support, had 6 infantry brigades defending the West Bank, 3 in Samaria to the north, 2 in Jerusalem, and 1 in the Judean hills south of Bethlehem. Another brigade was in reserve near Jericho. 2 armored brigades made up Jordan's striking force, 40 Brigade in the Jordan Valley and 60 Brigade ready to link up with Egyptian forces in the south. When the Egyptian attack across the Negev desert was checkmated by the Israeli attack, 60 Brigade was free to operate against the Israelis around Jerusalem. The Israelis faced Jordan with a very large Jerusalem Brigade, a reserve infantry brigade around Lod Airport, and a reserve infantry brigade near Netanya at Israel's narrowest point. 1 division could be borrowed from forces facing Syria in the north. This was enough to defend against the small but well-trained Royal Jordanian Army, but not enough to attack. Only when Jordan was committed to the war, and once Egypt was no longer a threat, could the General Staff release its operational reserve to the battle against Jordan. The attacking force against Jordan would be 10 Mechanized Brigade, under the brilliant Colonel Uri Ben-Ari, the German-born father of the Israeli Armored Corps. The cigar-chomping Ben-Ari was called up as a reservist to command the armored thrust against Jerusalem. With him were the reserve paratroops of 55 Para Brigade, prepared for a combat drop in Egypt, but no longer required. Ben-Ari moved his mechanized force through the rough hills to the north of Jerusalem, cutting the West Bank in half by the morning of the 6th of June. At the same time, the Israeli brigade at Lod Airport moved up to the old British fortress at Latrun and took it from Egyptian commandos. King Hussein, encouraged by his allies, launched an air attack against the Israelis.
When we look at King Hussein, we must remember the geopolitics of Jordan's position. Jordan was in control of what was going to become the West Bank. And Jordan was deeply suspicious of both Syrian motivations and Egyptian motivations.
And in order to keep the Jordanians fighting, and in order to keep the Jordanians attacking the Israelis, Nasser lies through his teeth to King Hussein.
Nasser did his very best to convince King Hussein that the Israeli Air Force, while they had actually dealt a severe blow to Egypt, had in fact themselves been shot out of the sky in very large numbers.
Nasser says to Hussein that 70% of the Israeli Air Force, a very strong asset that the enemy had been destroyed.
And so the pressure was on for King Hussein to get involved. In fact, if you look at the geopolitics of the situation, it is almost impossible to imagine a situation in which Jordan would not have become involved.
The Israeli Air Force, its missions in Egypt and Syria completed, turned their attention to Jordan and destroyed the Royal Jordanian Air Force. King Hussein ordered his 60th Armoured Brigade to move up from the Judean hills to oppose Ben Ari's mechanized force. As they moved out, they were destroyed from the air by Israeli close support missions. The Israeli paras unpacked their drop bags, put desert operations out of their minds, and drove to the Jerusalem area. They wrapped around Jerusalem from the north and east, surrounding the old city.
For 19 years, the Jordanians had been building defences around the old city of Jerusalem to stop the Israelis from attacking between Ramallah and the old city. And it was very much like an old First World War system of defences. It was made up of pre-surveyed killing zones, of trenches, of mutually supporting buildings, some several stories high, with cellars that were connected by trenches, barbed wires, mine, anti-tank and anti-personnel mines in between. And so it was a very, very difficult system to overcome. But of course, in the battle for Ammunition Hill, that's exactly what the Israelis do.
Some people suggest the Israelis should have bypassed it. And certainly in the Sinai, where you've got miles and miles of territory to work with, they might well have. But in order to maintain the momentum of the advance, the Israeli 55 Para Brigade has got to put in an attack on Ammunition Hill. They have got to be prepared to take a lot of casualties from close-in fighting in order to get around the northern perimeter of Jerusalem.
The fighting started at about 2 o'clock in the morning on the 6th of June, and it went on without intermission for 4 hours. It wasn't until dawn was breaking on the 6th of June that Ammunition Hill was under Israeli control. It is an epic in the history of the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force. It's also an epic in the history of the Jordanian army. Both sides came out with military honors just about equal.